Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for what should be an absolutely brilliant event. Yanis, thank you so much for coming as well. Just to kick things off, I'll go over how tonight's going to work. We'll have about half an hour where I'll ask some questions, then I'll open up to you guys. When I ask, please just raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone to you, and then you can ask away. But probably just off the bat, you speak and you write a lot about the EU, and particularly being quite sceptical, I think it's fair to say, of the EU. But rather than other Eurosceptics who call for getting rid of the EU, leaving the EU, you say no, we should have a more integrated, federated, united, democratic Europe. Do you think the war in Ukraine has made this more or less likely?
Much, much less likely. Let's be clear about this. It's a complete disaster for the European Union. By the way, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here again. Look, run a very depressing mental experiment with me, just for a moment, okay? At some point, it's not even an experiment. It's something that's going to happen. And I hope it happens quickly. It probably won't happen quickly, but it will happen at some point for certain. There will be peace talks between Moscow and Kyiv. There will be peace talks that are sponsored, presided over by the United States. There will be other countries represented there as well, hopefully China, hopefully India. Because this quagmire is not going to be resolved militarily. Even if there are shifts in the battlefield, at some point there's going to be a peace process. We know that the American president, whoever that might be, still Biden is with us by that time, is going to play a crucial role. The European Union is going to be asked by Washington, D.C. I'm going to lean over so I can see you because there is this thing here. The European Union is going to be asked by Washington to pay for the damage, to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine, to induct Ukraine in some form into the European Union. Certainly the common agricultural policy. Remember that Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world. It has a very large agricultural sector. It is clear that there's a global demand for helping Ukraine's agriculture. Who's going to do that? The Americans are good at waging war, whether it is in the Gulf or in helping the Ukrainian army. They send the tanks in, the airplanes, the bombs and so on. They are not very good with providing funding for reconstruction. They did it once with Marshall Aid, but they are not going to do it now. They are explicit on this. The Europeans will have to do it. Who is going to represent the European Union in these talks? At that table? Ursula von der Leyen. You only need to state it to realize that it is a joke. She doesn't represent anyone. Mr. Michel, you don't even know who he is. He's the President of the European Union Council. I don't think that his compatriots in Belgium know that. Is it going to be Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, or Emmanuel Macron, two formidable personalities? It doesn't matter whether you agree with them or not. They're two important personalities. No. They will be vetoed by Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and maybe Sweden, Finland as well, because they are considered to be too close to Putin, both Olaf Scholz and Emmanuel Macron. But can you imagine the European Union not being represented by the German-French axis that pays the bills? What I'm trying to get at is that the European Union has become geostrategically irrelevant within the continent of Europe. The fact that it's going to cost the European Union about €1 trillion, something like, 0.7, 0.8 of £1 trillion, at a time when, after 13 years of the debt crisis and the banking crisis and the various crises, the coronavirus crisis and so on, we have failed to utilize those crises in order to create a common debt instrument, a proper competitor to your gilts, to US Treasury bills, what we used to call Eurobonds. We don't have them. How will we find that 1 trillion euros? Where is it going to come from? At a time when the German industrial model is collapsing, because it is based on 3 pillars: cheap natural gas from Russia, gone; cheap German labor, gone, wages are rising because of inflation; and demand for its intermediate goods from China, which Washington DC is making sure is not going to happen by pitting Europe against China as part of a new Cold War. In other words, the war in Ukraine has accelerated the process of the fragmentation of the European Union. And thank you for pointing out that this is not a Brexiteer speaking. I'm not saying this with glee. I'm saying this as a Europeanist. As a Europeanist who, however, believes in staring reality in the face and not running away from the reality. We have failed. We used to say in Europe that Europe progresses from crisis to crisis. That was the case up until 2010. After 2010, every crisis that takes place creates a semblance of consolidation. We create new institutions, like the European Stability Mechanism, quantitative easing, the Recovery Fund. Each one of those institutions is worse than the previous one, more destructive than the previous one, and leaves a trail of damage behind it, not genuine consolidation. So I'm afraid that we are not moving closer towards a political union that many of us grew up wanting, desiring, imagining, and trying to work towards. I mean, I was in Mexico last week, and I was in very interesting conversations with the President of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, with the Foreign Minister of Mexico. Mexico is a substantial country, a very significant economic and regional power. And it was clear to me that they have no interest in the European Union. I mean, they do want to trade with the European Union, but they do not consider Europe to be a player in international affairs. They are very worried about the new Cold War between the United States and China. They're worried about the role of the war in Ukraine in the international financial and trade deglobalization dynamic, but they don't think that the European Union is an entity worthwhile engaging with. That's a major, major failure of the European Union. That doesn't mean you should have exited, right?
So on that, what role do you think Britain can have, should have, will have in Europe, in either forming a united Europe or in this sort of like stagnating pool that we seem to be in?
Well, you shouldn't have reached this point of having exited without a plan. I was a soft remainer, not a hard remainer. I was against Brexit, but I was not ever in favor of the hard remainers who presented the European Union as the best thing since sliced bread and who campaigned stupidly, idiotically, for a second referendum, which was just a major act of self-harm by the Remainers, because they showed such disrespect to the Brexiteers, saying we need a people's vote, as if the first one was not a people's vote, it was a cow's vote. Okay, so that's my attempt at not answering your question. So let me try to answer your question. I think that, to begin with, the United Kingdom must have a strategy for managing Brexit. It happened. Whether you like it or you don't like it, it's a reality. There has to be a plan of how does the United Kingdom differ from the European Union. So, for instance, what do you do about state aid? Because now there is state aid. The main reason why some left-wing Brexiteers wanted to get out of the European Union, which was state aid to UK-based businesses and so on. Well, Germany is doing it now. France is doing it now. And Britain is not doing it. There's no serious state aid to British industry. So you need a plan for your own investment program. You need an aggregate investment program. Britain is falling behind in terms of productivity in terms of the dynamic of your macroeconomy, because for the last 20 years you had pitiful investment at a time of massive liquidity. So you had huge liquidity. If you looked at the financial circuits of the City of London, never before had a country had so much money sloshing around. And yet, by comparison to the available liquidity, never before have you had such low levels of investment in things that you actually need, with maybe the exception of some green energy, which you did well at. So that needs to be redressed, and I think you need to ditch this idiocy about the Northern Ireland Protocol. Just accept that Northern Ireland is part of the single market. End of story. I mean, I believe that there are differences that are acceptable to even the unionists in Northern Ireland. For instance, they want to ban abortion in Northern Ireland when it's not banned in the rest of the United Kingdom. Well, it doesn't matter if you have a border across the Irish Sea. Just get over this big obstacle, because you need to have a new kind of trade agreement now with the European Union. Don't forget that the European Union is 50% of your international trade. So there's no sense in trying to seek a replacement of Europe as a trading partner in places like Australia or New Zealand. I mean, these are macroeconomically utterly insignificant places from a UK perspective. You know, and I would even like the Brexiteers, I would even like, you know, libertarians from the Tory party to tell me what they mean by Singapore on the Thames. What do they mean by that? Because I know Singapore, and I don't think they would like it if they understood it. For instance, did you know that Singapore has a state-owned corporation which has invested 120% of Singaporean GDP in public assets? They have bought companies around the area that belong to the state of Singapore. That's not exactly a libertarian's paradise. So when they say that we want to make this Singapore, you know, an offshore island of Europe, Singaporean style, what do they mean? Keir Starmer has no policy. He has a policy of not having a policy, which is also intriguing. So I would like an interesting conversation about what the plan for this country is.
It's funny you mentioned Keir Starmer. So you answered that Jeremy Corbyn should have had more ambition, and I think you would probably say the same thing about Keir now. So do you think that's why the left broadly has failed to take power? Is its lack of ambition?
Well, I wouldn't call Keir Starmer a left-winger. What he's done is he's taken the Labour Party back to the usual cartel between the two major parties. These parties are distinguishable anthropologically and aesthetically. You just need to look at them to realize that they're different. But in terms of actual policies, Keir Starmer was at Davos the other day, saying that under him, with him in 10 Downing Street, it will be business as usual. So, and you see, this is a serious failure of democracies when you have cartels of two parties, like, you know, the Democrats and the Republicans, or the Labour Party as it is now, and the Conservative Party, that are essentially making promises that they never mean to fulfill once they're in government, because there is an automatic pilot that governs the economic policies of both parties. And in the end, I don't think there's a great difference between Sunak and Starmer in terms of the big questions, like aggregated investment. What do you do with the banking system? What do you do with the City of London? What do you do with digital currencies? What do you do with workers' rights? What do you do with the fact that there is a constant attempt for 40 years in this country to keep an impossible bubble going? This is your housing market. You know, you have invested in a Ponzi scheme. Britain is based on a housing Ponzi scheme since the sale of council houses by Margaret Thatcher. Because think about it, what Thatcher did, which was politically genius, It's the reason why she was so dominant. She deindustrialized Britain. There were these industries. You may think that they were antiquated, whatever they were, but you had steel production, you had coal production, you had car production, you had the production of a number of industrial goods. Those went. Within 2 years, they had gone all. And what was it replaced with? It was replaced by the City of London financialization, which had two major forces driving it. One was the sale of council houses. Because when you have a working class family that has a council house, they pay a small amount of rent every month until they die. And suddenly you say to them, okay, this house has a market value of 40,000 quid, we'll sell it to you for 15,000. Share owners' democracy or homeowners' democracy. That was Thatcher. Sounds great, right? Who would say no? You're given something that is worth in the marketplace 40,000 for 15,000. You go to the bank manager, you say, will you give a mortgage for that? The bank manager will say, of course. Of course. The bank manager can never lose because the collateral is worth 40,000 and he gives you 15,000. Even if you mess things up, he takes your house. He makes a profit, right? So suddenly, there is a rush of financing into the housing market. House prices start rising because then they like the idea that they bought a house worth 40,000 for 15, and then they upgrade. They sell it and they move up into a leafier suburb of Liverpool or Birmingham or wherever. Okay? That creates a dynamic. Everybody feels richer. It's all hot air. It's all, debt. At the same time, you have the same government selling British Gas, the electricity grid, British Airways, banks like the Trustee Savings Bank and so on, at no more than 40% of its market value. So what you do is you say to people, right, look, if you buy shares in this company, next morning you will have doubled your money. So they went to the bank again, and the bank manager again, I used to live in Britain then, I remember that. People would say to me, won't you use your quota to buy British Gas shares? I said, no, I won't. But can I use your quota? Because they knew that, for every 1,000 quid you spend to get a British Gas share, next morning you get another 1,000, right? So that created, firstly, an electoral triumph for one after the other, 3 to be precise, for Thatcher, and it created a buoyant consumer culture while you were deindustrializing, right? So, but that's a Ponzi scheme, because at some point you know the standard saying, and Thatcher used to use that against us socialists, that the problem with socialists is that at some point you run out of other people's money. She used to say about us, which is true. If you use other people's money to do socialism, then at some point, this is a Ponzi scheme, it collapses. But similarly, she did capitalism with hot air. At some point, that collapses. And you are experiencing now this long, drawn-out period of stagnation as a result of the fact that you have not used the liquidity that was created by the City of London to invest.
So do you think the reason why the left hasn't been successful in pushing itself forward, the reason why Keir Starmer is going back towards this old consensus, is that because of this Ponzi scheme, or is there another reason behind the left's failure to win power?
I think it's related, but I would like to take it at a higher level of abstraction. It's good to be in a university again. I can do that. In Parliament, I'm not allowed to do this. Things are thrown at me when I try to be too theoretical. Not really. I get dirty looks. Look, if you think about the success of the left in Britain, what is it? Attlee, 1945, 1950, and Harold Wilson, late 60s, early 70s. Social democracy, British style. What was the basic idea behind that kind of genuine social democratic Labourism? The idea was that you elect a Labour government that is progressive and wants to introduce a national health service, universities that don't charge fees, as was the case until Blair, and social security, and a degree of protection of workers' rights, and a redistribution of income between the profits of industrialists, the factory owners, the mine owners, and the workers, the trade unions. And the idea was that, Attlee or Harold Wilson would be the referees. There would be a big table where social classes would gather, the industrialists and the trade unions primarily, and the government would stand between them and negotiate, help them negotiate a deal whereby a portion of the surplus value of the profits of the capitalists is given to the workers to achieve industrial peace and a degree of inclusion. Another part of the profits of the industrialists goes to the state to pay for the NHS. This is, broadly speaking, the idea, right? So you have industrial capital, and you have labor, and you have the state playing the role of the referee. And that was a major success. That civilized Britain and other countries, like the Federal Republic of Germany, even to a large extent, Roosevelt did that with a New Deal in the United States. That's social democracy as I understand it. However, after 1971 and the end of Bretton Woods, the world changed in my eyes. Industrial capital lost power in the West. Industry shifted to the East, increasingly. It had already shifted to Japan from the 1950s. By the 1980s, 1990s, it had shifted to Southeast Asia and, of course, the powerhouse, China. It was American companies, French companies, British companies that shifted industrial production there. Industrial capital was replaced in a place like the United Kingdom by financial capital, by the city, by the mortgage givers that I mentioned before. So, even if you had the most well-meaning Labour Prime Minister in the 80s, 90s, and beyond, wishing to recreate this large negotiating table with industrial capital and trade unions, it would be irrelevant, because industrial capital had gone. It was finance. Finance is never going to negotiate with trade unionists, even if trade unions exist. But negotiate what? All they want to do is give mortgages. So you have a new bargain by the second generation of social democrats, people like Tony Blair, the third way it used to be called. I never understood what the second way was, but anyway. Gerhard Schröder in Germany, various administrations under François Mitterrand in France, Bill Clinton in the United States. That's the second wave, far removed from the first wave of Roosevelt, Attlee, the Social Democrats in Germany, in Austria, like Kreisky and so on. The second generation of Social Democrats did something completely different. They had a one-on-one relationship with the financiers. Clinton with Wall Street, Blair with the City of London. So they had a bargain. And the bargain was as follows. Really very simple. The politician would say to the banker, we will let you do whatever you want. We will deregulate you. We will liberate you, emancipate you from all the shackles of the New Deal, of the City of London that prevented people from betting with their customers' money. In exchange, a small percentage of the massive profits you will make as a result of deregulation, you will give them to us to pay for the NHS. Because it is true that the Blair administration, increased substantially the funding for the NHS. Where did the money come from? From the city. Now, the problem with this Faustian bargain, if I may call it that, is that it is based on hot air. It's not it's not like, you know, an industry producing stuff that has substantial actual value and the price. You have the City of London and Wall Street producing nothing except pyramids. I remember a discussion in which I was very privileged to be sitting there listening. I was not a participant in the discussion, but I was, like you, a member of the audience. Paul Volcker, who used to be the chairman of the Fed between 1979 and 1987, appointed by Carter and then reappointed by Reagan for one term. A very smart man. I disagreed with him on many things politically, but a smart central banker. After 2008, when Wall Street and the City of London collapsed, he was given the job by Obama, not really, but there was a pretense that he was given the job of cleaning up Wall Street. And he tried to introduce, as an 85-year-old by that stage, a number of impediments upon the financial sector, you know, just some shackles of the kind that had been done away with in the 1980s and 1990s, the deregulation. And there was the representative of JP Morgan, of Goldman Sachs, of the Bank of America, of Barclays, all these bigwigs. And they were up in arms. Mr. Volcker, by imposing all these restrictions on us, you are not allowing us to launch financial products of great value to the economy. And Paul Volcker says, you know what? I've been in banking all my life, since the 1950s, early 1950s. In all my years of financial innovation, financially innovative products, that's what the bankers say. The only innovation I've seen coming out of finance is the ATM. There's no innovation in finance except newfangled types of complicated debt so that you don't see that it is debt. But that's what it is. Right? The trouble with these pyramids that Blair was milking in order to pay for the NHS is that they collapse. That's what pyramids do. If you keep, you know, houses of cards, at some point they collapse. 2008. And then, what do the social democrats in authority do? Their campaigns have been funded by those bankers. Their NHS has been funded by those bankers. Those bankers have actually bet the house, the country, and lost. But these social democrats have neither the analytical power nor the moral strength to say to those bankers, well, you bet, you lost, out. We're now going to nationalize the banks, cleanse them, and then we can sell them again if we wish. But you are out, which is what happened in South Korea in 1998. Before that, it had happened in Sweden in 1992. It didn't happen in 2008. So at that point, the Labour Party is finished. You have a Labour Party that is in the pockets of the financiers. And it's not a Labour Party anymore. Because there's no industrial capital to be the partner of Labour with a social democratic government playing the role of referee.
There's an awful lot to unpack there, but I'm going to do one more question and then I'm going to open up to you guys so you guys can ask your questions and hopefully pick up on some of the stuff you mentioned. I think one thing that you said before, and there are times you very clearly disagree with colleagues in the left, colleagues in the Progressive International, also on issues like whether to leave the EU or stay and help it and sort of reform it. Why do you think the left generally seems to have a tendency to allow disagreements to degenerate into civil wars with itself?
It's like the Christians. After the Roman Empire, okay, the greatest enemy of an Orthodox Christian was a Catholic Christian. It wasn't the lions and it wasn't Islam. People who want to change the world, rather than to simply adapt themselves to the world, have a tendency, which is a tragic one, to think of themselves as messiahs and to believe their own rhetoric and to believe their own self-importance. You know, who has not watched The Life of Brian? Yeah? It's all in there. The first scene in The Life of Brian is your answer. Okay? We are the Liberation Front of Judea, and our greatest enemy is the People's Front for Liberating Judea, or something like that. And, you know, we left-wingers, and generally people who want to change the world, we really need to have a duty to take ourselves far less seriously and not to assume that we have the monopoly of virtue. That's the problem with the Christians in the life of, or the Jews in the Life of Brian. And it is a problem of leftists who want to change the world and, in the end, reproduce tyranny amongst themselves in order, or in the process of supposedly liberating the world from tyranny. Don't forget, you know, people tell me that Stalin was anti-Semitic. Well, he killed lots of Jews. Do you know why he killed them? Because they were communists. The Gulag was created by communists for communists. And just because many of them were Jewish, they also died. So it's awful what we've done to ourselves. And in the process, we've been completely and utterly discredited. You use the word communism now, and what comes to people's mind? The Gulag. I have no doubt that if I lived in the Soviet Union, I would be in the Gulag. And I'm saying this as a leftist, because we really must be self-critical above everything else.
Brilliant. If you want to raise your hands, and we can do some questions from the audience. Let's just go to the front row here.
Just to expound on what you just said, I would also be in Gulag if I was born probably like 60 years ago. So I come from Lithuania, which is post-USSR country. And my question is a little bit something maybe outside what you usually speak about, which is about Eastern Europe. I don't, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like you haven't really talked about it that much, about a certain region. So the left in Eastern Europe is non-existent. It's not there. I know, like, for other people in Lithuania that are socialist as well. And if I go back home and I say I'm a socialist, the one thing that comes, like, the only answer that I get is like, oh, but Stalin killed so many people. Why are you socialist? Like, you know, so that's just really upsetting. And so thinking about European Union, even though I'm a really hard socialist, I feel like being a part of European Union for the Eastern European countries where the left is non-existent has done quite good, because European Union is definitely more social democratic than Eastern European countries are. And because they want, like, we want to be Western so bad. So so we just copy anything that the West does. And I feel like copying European Union and its social democratic policies is better than not being in EU. So I was just wondering if you have any opinion on that, and Eastern Europe in general, and maybe what the left, the tiny left in Eastern Europe should do to maybe increase their participation.
I agree entirely with you. When I was growing up in Greece, we were not in the European Union. We are under a fascist right-wing dictatorship. And to my parents, to myself, to most people I know, Europe didn't mean trade. It didn't mean the European Commission. It didn't mean any of those things. It meant a possibility to live without the fear of the secret police. And that is invaluable. I understand that in my bones. I also understand that if you are gay, lesbian, LGBT, and you live in Poland, you really dread the idea that Poland might leave the European Union, because your life is not going to be worth living. Okay? So the European Union is a bulwark against bigotry in countries where bigotry is having a second wind, like Hungary, for instance. The bad name that socialism got in countries that had supposedly socialism is inevitable. But look, it's nothing new, really. Let me remind you that democracy got a very bad name as a result of the French Revolution that turned into a bloodbath in the name of democracy. I don't believe that in 1800, just because the democratic revolution, that was the French Revolution, turned into a bloodbath, that was a reason to ditch the idea of democracy. In the same way that I don't believe that a Christian believer needs constantly to apologize about the Spanish Inquisition. I feel that I need to constantly apologize for the Gulag. Finally, regarding your question, what should the Lithuanian left, or the Estonian left, or the Polish left do? Well, stop thinking of Russia as a monolithic entity. The way I try to think about a country like Russia is as a contested terrain. I have friends of mine who, as we speak, are in prison because they've opposed Putin. Russophobia is racism. It is not a political project. Or if it is a political project, it is a fascist political project. Essentially, it is the best gift you can give Vladimir Putin, to be Russophobic. You've got to ask yourself, not just you, all of us, when we do X or think X or propose X that affects the war in Ukraine today or Russia, what helps our democratic comrades who are languishing under the Putin regime? That's what we must think. One of the great tragedies of the Baltic countries, for instance, is that there are Russian Democrats who are escaping, trying to escape into the Baltic countries, and the governments of the Baltic countries turn them back, saying, oh, you should go back and fight. Now, that is something that the left in the Baltics must really work very hard to create solidarity with Russian Democrats.
Just at the front row here.
Is it on? Oh, okay.
Yes,
thank you very much for coming. There's lots of political questions that you've asked, but I want to ask maybe more of like an existential philosophical question, since you're in uni and you like being abstract. Previously, you've described the modern economy as techno-feudalism, where if you, and to quote you, I think you said something like, you walk out onto the high street and there's all these adverts around, and it's like that movie, if you put the sunglasses on, it's just that company name saying, give me my money. As somebody who's like worked previously in Amazon for these companies, like in their warehouse, and you know, everybody in this room who goes to University of Cambridge is probably privileged enough to maybe work logistically at one of these companies. How do you settle the moral debate for someone like me or many of us in this room who want to be good people, who don't want to continue this exploitation, but find ourselves constantly funneled into, if we want to succeed in life, if we want to make money, if we want to be happy, we have to go be in the finance sector. Like the University of Cambridge is known for being like briefcase socialism, where all these kids will be communists when they're in first year, but then by third year they'll be working for JP Morgan and talking about it on LinkedIn. So how do I justify, or how do we justify living in capitalism and continuing to sort of perpetuate it on a technical sense, but liberating those people around the world, or even in the current country, who are going through these cost of living crises and are struggling economically? How do we use our power to, like, you know, help them, basically?
I never moralize. I never tell people what I think they should be doing. I don't think it works. And I also don't think that I have the moral right to do it. My attitude is to accept that people know what's best for them, to respect their sovereignty, and to engage them in a conversation and see where it goes. Understanding is 50% of the task of creating a better world. I truly believe this is why, you know, maybe that's why I've been an academic all my life until I got sidetracked into politics. But I truly believe that, you know, a genuine, honest search for truth, for how things work. Not the truth, but, for enlightenment is crucial. Now, whether you want to then take your enlightenment and rent it out to JP Morgan or Barclays, I'm not going to pass judgment on you for that. My personal advice to my daughter, for instance, is I don't think you'll have a good life if you do it. I would never say you shouldn't do it. My concern is, what brings about a successful life? Happiness, in the end. That's what it's all about. And I don't think you can be happy working for the City of London, personally. If you are, good, go into it. And I'm not going to, moralize. But you asked me about techno-feudalism. Look, I've got 6 more pages to write for the next book, which will be called Techno-Feudalism. So thank you for bringing it up. I don't know whether you knew it or not. I have to hand over those last 6 pages next week to my London publisher. It's a very strange book, and it is a book that annoys left-wingers more than anybody else. I like doing that, annoying my own ilk. You know why the left-wingers don't like the idea? Because, okay, let me tell you basically what my thesis is. This has been my thesis now for 7, 8 years, but it's only now that I sat down and articulated in a form that makes sense as a book. My view is that 1991 was the end of socialism, as we understood it. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of Yugoslavia, the collapse of even social democracy, the first phase of social democracy, and the degeneration of social democracy into Blairism, third wave, that kind of thing. So 1991 was our Waterloo, the Waterloo for the left. 2008 was the Waterloo for capitalism. I believe that in 2008, we had the beginnings of the demise of capitalism. Now, this is a very controversial thing to say that capitalism is dying, because wherever you look today, you see capital triumphing. Different forms of capital. And that is completely correct. The triumph of capital today is greater than it has ever been in the history of capitalism, in the history of humanity. But capital is not the same thing as capitalism. We have a new form of capital, structurally different from other forms of capital, that is triumphing and undermining capitalism. That's a delicious contradiction. Capital is doing so well that it is killing off capitalism. What is this new form of capital, if I may say a few words about this? I call it cloud capital. Capital in the form of steam engines, machinery, industrial robots, 3D printers are produced means of production. Something that has been produced to produce something else. Not to be consumed, right? Steam engine. You produce it in order to help produce something else. Industrial robot, the same thing. What's cloud capital? Is a produced means of behavioral modification. Now, the point of debates like this is to modify behavior. For me to convince you about things that you weren't convinced about before. And therefore, hopefully, change to some small extent your behavior. That's what preachers have done all their lives, politicians, academics. That's the point of rhetoric, of advertising, of marketing. Behavioral modification. But up until recently, behavioral modification has been the realm of humans. Since big tech rose up, behavioral modification has been passed on to machinery, especially artificial intelligence, algorithms. You mentioned Amazon. Think of the whole Amazonian construction. You've got data farms. Most of the business of Amazon is not the warehouses, it's data centers. You've got Alexa sitting on your desk, if you bought one, right? Alexa is supposedly your slave. You say to Alexa, set an alarm clock, or switch on the lights, or order milk, or remind me to do this, or can you recommend a good book for me to read while I'm on holiday? So it's your servant. It's not your servant. It is a portal connected to the data servers, to the algorithmic capital of Amazon.com. And what it does, Alexa, the little machine, is it allows you to train it, so that it gives you the kind of advice when you ask for book choices, film choices, that impresses you, so that next time it gives you advice to buy something that Jeff Bezos wants you to buy, you'll buy it. That's what I mean by produced means of behavioral modification. And think of it. It is also the same algorithm that does two other things simultaneously. When you're working in an Amazon warehouse, you have a little machine on you that dictates your every move. It's part of the same algorithm as the one that trains me to train it to train me to buy the things that you stock for me using another appendix of the same cloud capital. And it's a market alternative. Amazon.com, ladies and gentlemen, is not a marketplace. There are buyers and there are sellers. But the metaphor of the market town is completely and utterly wrong. Because when you have a market, it's decentralized. The whole point about the market is that it is decentralized, right? There are buyers, there are sellers. Every buyer has their own mind. They can choose to see what they see and not to see what they, not to go window shopping at that shop to go to another one, right? To talk to one another. Maybe you and me to say, you know what, I'm not going to buy Coca-Cola. Why? Because Coca-Cola played a role in the assassination of Allende in Chile. That's an example, right? We can have, they did. We can have a little discussion about that, okay? And we can coordinate our activities. We can choose to do this or not to do this, okay? Even if it is monopolized, even if one person takes over the village market and sells everything, again, we as buyers have a degree of sovereignty. But when you move into Amazon.com, if you and me enter Amazon.com right now, this very moment, and we ask it for a recommendation for something, we won't get the same recommendation. Because the algorithm knows our different patterns, ages, likes, dislikes, and it is equivalent of you and me walking out into Cambridge town, walking next to each other, but you seeing different things to the ones that I'm seeing when we are looking at in the same direction. And what we see is determined by the person who owns the town, the park benches, the pavement, the air we breathe, Jeff Bezos. That's Amazon.com. That is not a market. It is a fief. It is a fiefdom. It's a digital fiefdom. It's what I call cloud capital. So when I was thinking in those terms, I thought, my goodness, this is not capitalism anymore. It's a variety of feudalism, which is based on a new form of capital. Now, when we went from feudalism to capitalism, it was a triumph of capital over land. Land was what gave feudal lords the power to extract ground rent from the peasants, from the vassals, right? With the steam engine and the textile industry and the mines and so on, power shifted from those who owned land to those who owned machines. That's capitalism. We have not gone back to land, but we have a new kind of land, because a space to sell your stuff within Amazon.com or Alibaba, the Chinese equivalent, or some other e-commerce platform, is a kind of digital land, and it extracts a ground rent from the beginning. Think of why is the iPhone so successful? It's a good phone, But there are better phones, or there could be better phones. The reason why the iPhone is very successful is the Apple Store. What is the Apple Store? It is a place, fictional digital place, where you have millions of third-party developers, I call them vassals, digital vassals, who are like proto-capitalists. They are little entrepreneurs. They create applications, and they sell them on the App Store, on the Apple Store, right? And Apple collects 30%, that's ground rent. So this is it, you see, you have an advanced form of capital, which has the capacity to pay a cloud rent to the new ruling class, who are no longer just capitalists. I call them cloudalists in my book, because they own cloud capital. And increasingly, those who simply produce stuff lose power. So BMW, Bavarian Motorwerke, up until now a very successful car company. Finito. It will be Tesla. Not because Elon Musk is cleverer, or a nicer person, no. But because the value added that comes from cars in the future will not come from engineering a beautiful gearbox. Now cars are electric. Most of the electric motors are produced in China. They are really very simple stuff to produce. They have very few moving parts. You don't need mechanical excellence to produce them, unlike the V8 engines of a Mercedes-Benz or a Ferrari or something like that. So that's gone. And the value added is going to come from what? From the cloud. Because the company that controls the data flows of the self-driving cars, of the electric cars, of knowing where you've been, what music were you listening to when you were driving your Tesla, or the equivalent of Tesla, or a Neo, or whatever, Chinese version of Tesla. It will all be value that is amassed in that cloud thief. Anyway, I went on for too long. I'm getting excited because it's the book that I'm trying to finish next week.
No worries.
Sorry about that.
We've have time for about 2 more questions. Just at the very back, up there.
Hello. I was just wondering that in a world where capital moves fluidly across borders, and the people moving those large amounts of financial capital fluidly across borders are corporations, multinational corporations, often states and democratic leaders feel absolutely beholden to them. How, in the context of the 21st century, do you challenge that kind of power and do it in a way to reassert democratic socialism which corporations can't disrupt with the overwhelming advantage they have in the architecture of the economy?
This is the killer question. The short answer is I don't know, right? It's mind-boggling to try to imagine how you can overcome the immense power of financial capital to move about at the speed of light, undermine the work of flesh and blood people, to create bubbles which then burst, that create then bankruptcies, which then create new power relations that are oppressive and extractive. But to me, it seems that China offers a glimpse of how it could be, not of how it is, of how it could be. Because if you think of it, and this is not a eulogy on China, right? Again, if I lived in China, I would probably be in a prison. But the Chinese economic miracle happened because they at once created fantastic financialization devices and circuits. So today, for instance, if you are Chinese and you use WeChat, the application that belongs to Tencent, you can, using the same app, you can stream music or videos. Talk to your friends, read newspapers, and make payments, all without getting out of that app. Something you cannot do in the West. You have to get out of your app to go into the, your Lloyd's Bank or NatWest. So they have financialized, but at the same time they've kept very strict capital controls. So money goes in to China, leaves China, but it's not unfettered. I think we cannot both have democracy, freedom of movement, and freedom of capital movement. You have to choose. If you go, for instance, to North Mexico or South United States, and you take a look at that hideous border between America and Mexico, the wall that Donald Trump wanted to build, it's there in a variety of ugly ways. And you just stop. I've done that, and I was in awe of what I could see in crossing points where you see huge trucks carrying goods that are produced by American companies on the southern side within Mexico, rushing towards Walmart and towards shopping malls in North America, while people cannot move. People die trying to cross over. This labor immobility, human immobility, these walls that fence people in while allowing commodities and capital to flow freely. That is detrimental to the interests of American workers, of Mexican workers, of the environment, if you look at the environmental footprint of this kind of industry. So, China has produced an economic model which generates wealth, allows value added to stay within the country, and theoretically could be democratized as long as we take over from the Chinese Communist Party. But in principle, you have a ruling party that I don't think can bank on having power forever. No ruling regime lasts forever. But you have an economic model which is capable of generating wealth and redistributing it according to collectively decided principles. That is interesting.
Brilliant. Let's do one more. Let's just go, man in the Cambridge jumper. There you go.
So I know you've written and spoken a lot about this, but during your short time as finance minister, you felt constrained massively by EU requirements on how Greece should manage its debt, or during the debt crisis in 2015 and what you've called the Troika. So with sort of those constraints maybe continuing and an economy which hasn't fully recovered from the financial crisis in 2008, what sort of policy mechanisms do you think going forward should be taken to sort of help Greece begin to recover on its growth path that it had pre-crisis?
Oh my goodness, where do I start? Look, you must be British. You have a finely developed sense of understatement. To say that I was, constrained by EU demands is precisely that. The art of the understatement. They were throttling us. And what they were throttling us about was such a delicious irony, or would have been if it weren't so tragic, because they were insisting that we should take more credit cards to repay the previous credit cards. So look, the whole of the Eurozone was constructed, it was constructed as if, imagine you take a car, you remove the shock absorbers, and then you drive it into a pothole. The equivalent of that. They created a currency that would, with mathematical precision, generate an almighty banking and debt crisis. Of course it happened, and then they tried to cover it up. And they tried to cover it up by means of loans to the bankrupt. like us, okay? And all I tried to do was to say, no, I'm not going to take another credit card. I'm going to embrace my bankruptcy, okay? Either you will restructure our debts, because let's say you have an unpayable debt, right? There are only two things that you can do. One is to accept it, that it's unpayable, and come to an agreement with your banker and say, listen, I owe you 100, I cannot give you 100, you have to accept 20. Or you have to accept a certain percentage of how much money I make for a certain period of time, and then you write off the rest. Or you have extending and pretending. The banker comes and says, you owe me 100, here is 150, so that for the next 2 years you repay me the 100. And then, of course, you will owe, with interest, 380, and then they will have to give you another loan. So I was trying to prevent that. It's really very simple, okay? And what has happened now is nobody talks about Greece's bankruptcy, because in the European Union, but more broadly too, when it comes to political entities like states, who is bankrupt and who is not is a political decision. So in 2010, they decided, the powers that be, Berlin, Frankfurt, that we were bankrupt. In other words, that they would allow you folks to know that we were bankrupt. Today, they don't allow it anymore because they had 10 years of that. They had enough. They thought, okay, enough of Greece in the front pages of newspapers. We'll pretend that it's all gone. How did they do it? Let me tell you. In the last 2 years, the Central Bank of Europe has lent the Greek state another 55 billion. So now we have, together, private and public debt of something like 800, forget the zeros, and we have an income of 200. It will never be paid. But as long as they keep lending us the money with which we pay them back, and the whole thing balloons and balloons and balloons ad infinitum, we're not in the newspapers. Now, there are conditions, however, there are strings attached to this extending and pretending. We have VAT of 24%. In a broken economy, you have VAT of 24%. This is what you do to a country if you want to destroy it. Can you imagine VAT of 24% in a country that cannot make ends meet? Another example. If you run a small business, imagine you run a small business in Greece, and your tax bill is 10,000 quid. You have to pay tax, corporation tax, 10,000. Do you know how much you need to pay? 20,000. Because you have to pay what the taxman, the tax authorities, predict your tax will be next year, and you need to prepay it this year. Do you believe that? You don't believe it. It's true in Greece. Well, okay. So under those circumstances, you have the incredible shrinking economic fiber of Greece. You have large speculative funds coming in and buying all the beauty spots. So, if we continue like this, we are going to be like Hawaii. Sounds good, eh? It's not. It's a tragedy. Have you been to Hawaii? Don't go. It's ugly. It's an ugly social reality. The big island of Hawaii, okay? A beautiful place, there's no doubt about that. 5-star hotels around the island, all owned by American, Japanese, foreign investors. The Hawaiians, the indigenous people, live in the center of the island in slums. In slums. They are ferried in minibuses every morning, at 6 in the morning, to the 5-star hotels to clean the toilets, play, guitars and do all that. And then at night they're taken back. That's the logical conclusion of where my country is going to be if we continue to extend and pretend. So we need to stop doing it. The optimal strategy when you're digging a hole is to stop digging.
I think that's a brilliant note to end on. There's one really quick question which I ask everyone that comes. Is there a book or a movie that you'd recommend?
Oh my goodness, this is a terrible question. I need to give you 200.
Give you one.
But you want me to give you one?
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, I mean, what can I do? I'm going to say Citizen Kane. I'm going to be very boring when it comes to movies. But, it's always very topical. And if you haven't watched it for a while, I think you should watch it. The ancient Greek tragedy. Rupert Murdoch is in there. the broken politics of the West, human fallibility, and beautiful acting and excellent editing. Book, the collective words of Shakespeare. If you have to have one book on a desert island, it has to be Shakespeare.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Yanis. Go clap. Thank you. Just a few announcements before we all go. Tomorrow we have Neil Tennant from the Pet Shop Boys coming. The debate this week is on whether this house would rather be a sinner or a saint, and that's on Thursday. And on Friday we have the renowned art forger Max Brandet, who's going to come along and show us how to forge art. So can we just thank you, Yanis, one last time, and thank you.